Yeah, we had a bit more data from Labour than we normally get from parties in their manifesto, so it was possible to do a bit more in the way of forensic than we normally do. These are the kind of raw charts from the manifesto itself. Let's take those and turn those into something that's slightly more digestible. Here you can see on the left-hand column, this, by the end of next Parliament, is what Labour wants to spend their extra money on in terms of current spending, so a big amount on education, £25.3 billion extra spent on education every year. Really, this was a manifesto about education when you look at the pure data. That's really the interesting thing that didn't necessarily come out from the actual presentation itself. Health and social care, an extra £8 billion or so on that. Work and pensions, so benefits, only £4.6 billion extra spent on that, which is a little interesting given that how much talk there was from Jeremy Corbyn about inequality. You know, you'd have thought that would be bigger, and you'd thought he'd have reversed the freeze that the Tories have there, but he didn't. Other plans to essentially get rid of the cap on public sector pay and a few other things, extra police officers, that cut tots it up to £11 billion. And in total, that's £48.6 billion extra spending every year by the end of the Parliament. Can they make that up through taxes? Well, here's what they intend to raise their taxes using. So corporation tax goes up to 26%. They think that's going to bring in £19.4 billion. Income tax on the highest 5%. That should bring in £6.4 billion, they say. And then you've got other business taxes and avoidance adding it up. And it comes up actually in total to a bit more than this column. But then they assume there's going to be some behavioural change, that people will shift their income. They won't necessarily work as much and generate as much tax. Some people like the IFS say, actually, corporation tax, income tax, the receipts from that could be a lot smaller. So that column on the right could actually be much smaller than the one on the left. That's the situation when it comes to taxes. What about borrowing? Because we know that Labour plan to borrow a bit more to invest. Well, this is the deficit over the past few years. The coalition and then the Tory government have been getting it gradually lower, and they plan to do so. A little bit of a hump there, but they plan to do so in the future. Labour plan to borrow more, and so that's what things would look like under Labour. Higher rather than the lower borrowing. Actually, it's about £25 billion higher every single year, pushing up the national debt, but it isn't necessarily part of that current spending. And not much talked about, actually, in the manifesto. In terms of taxes, and this is kind of a striking chart, this shows you the tax burden in the UK all the way back to that post-war period, 1948. And gradually, broadly speaking, over that period, it's averaged out at about 32% of GDP. If you do it as a percent of GDP to be comparable, the Conservatives, under them, you might remember the story recently, it will actually go up to the highest level since the 1980s. But just look at what will happen to this if we take in those Labour plans to raise taxes. The tax burden would go significantly higher. In fact, at this level, it would be the highest level since 1949. A striking figure there. Finally, the question of who is actually going to be paying those taxes. Well, this shows you just how many taxpayers are paying taxes under the current system and under Labour. So, at the moment, 24 million people paying the basic rate of income tax. The vast majority of people paying just that basic rate of income tax. You've got 4 million people at the moment paying the 40p rate. And under Labour, that would be actually a little bit lower. But just look at this. We'll take the higher rate, so anything over 40%. At the moment, 350,000 people pay the 45p rate. That's the highest rate right now. Under Labour, 800,000 people would be paying that rate, anyone earning over 80k a year. And then on top of that, you'd have an extra 50p rate, the return of the 50p rate. And 500,000 people would end up paying that. It's far more than paid it the first time around when Labour first introduced it. So just look at that red bit on the side. That's the bit that's increasing, and that is Labour's plan to try and raise that extra money from higher rate taxpayers. But according to Paul Johnson, head of the IFS, they warn that actually when you look into the numbers, when you dig into what's likely to happen, it won't just be higher rate taxpayers who are having to shoulder all of the costs.
In terms of the income tax changes they're proposing, they're talking about just increasing income tax on those earning over 80,000 a year. That is the top 5% or so of income taxpayers. But of course, the very big tax increases here are on companies. Companies, in the end, don't pay tax. The only people who can pay tax are either their customers, so will face higher prices, or their employees, so they get lower earnings, or any of us who have got money invested in a pension will get lower returns. So actually, that tax on companies, you won't see it hitting you, but it will.
So there was Paul Johnson from the IFS, but I suspect it's going to be this chart. We showed it just a moment ago that's going to dominate front pages tomorrow. Under Labour, we would have the highest tax burden in the UK since the post-war period. A striking revelation from this manifesto. The question is whether people want to vote for that or not.